Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome Lieutenant General Murray and Lieutenant General Anderson. It's good to have you here before us today. I look forward to hearing from you both about the Army's modernization priorities, particularly in light of the release of the President's fiscal year 2018 budget outline yesterday and the fiscal year 2017 amended budget earlier today. Like many of my colleagues, I have long been concerned by the Budget Control Act spending caps on defense and the constraints it has placed on our ability to make thoughtful investments in areas needed to keep our country and our service members safe. But I also believe that domestic spending caps in the BCA are equally devastating to our economic health and our national competitiveness, which are critical components to a strong national defense and security. The fiscal year 17 budget amendment shows an overall increase for the DoD of $30 billion, along with $3 billion for the Department of Homeland Security. However, it also shows an unspecified $18 billion reduction to non-defense accounts without providing any details, which I find quite concerning. With regard to fiscal year 2018, though we have not yet seen all of the details, many of the non-defense top-line agency numbers are deeply troubling, such as the proposed 30% cut to the State Department, a move over 120 retired generals and admirals spoke out against in a recent letter to Congress. Likewise, the proposed fiscal year 18 budget would make devastating cuts to the EPA and the Departments of Labor, Education, and Commerce, among many others. Simply put, this budget would do great damage to our nation and our national defense, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to strongly oppose its implementation. But with that in mind, I look forward to hearing from you both on today's topic. Since the creation of the all-volunteer force in the 1970s, the Army and the nation have wrestled with finding the right balance between prioritizing funding for military personnel, including training, pay, benefits, housing, and associated costs, and procuring the best and most capable equipment. And this tension is more pronounced during times of flat or declining budgets, as the cost of recruiting, training, sustaining, and retaining the most capable troops in the world has gone up in order to best prepare and protect them for the challenges they face. Finding the appropriate balance has grown even more difficult. While all services would prefer to have both, lots of troops and lots of modernization funds for better equipment, there have been only a few times in the last 40 years where fully funding both accounts has been possible, given the many pressing needs across the DoD budget. Various Army Chiefs of Staff have confronted this issue, but in most cases, the Army has chosen to maintain the size of the force while delaying or even canceling important modernization efforts. The Army is again facing this choice. The full committee received testimony several weeks ago from the Army Vice Chief, where we heard that the Army has serious capability gaps in some areas, such as long-range fires, air defense, vehicle protection, electronic warfare, and mobility for light units. At the same time, this committee has been told the Army is too small in size to carry out its assigned missions without continuing to place a heavy burden on current service members and their families. Over the years, this committee has tried to help on both fronts. In many years, Army equipment, research, and procurement accounts have been increased, including this subcommittee's efforts to fund M1 Abrams tank upgrades needed to maintain our superiority on the battlefield. Just this past year, the committee stopped the Army's personnel drawdown at $4,776,000 in response to increasing demand for soldiers around the world by our combatant commanders. And the committee has also shown consistent bipartisan support for increasing funding for force protection initiatives, from body armor to vehicle armor, to make sure we are providing the best life-saving equipment for the men and women we send into harm's way. For today's hearing, I'd like to hear from you, our distinguished witnesses, about how the Army is thinking about this balance between people and modernization. If the Army is asked to grow significantly in size in the forthcoming budget, how will it plan to address the equipment gaps we've been told about? What options are there for accelerating current equipment programs? What is the tipping point where the Army is simply too big to properly equip, given the higher cost of today's more complex ground combat equipment? I look forward to addressing these and other issues in today's hearing. I look forward to your testimony. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we're discussing the really important issue, I think, of the modernization investments that the Army needs to make, I'd like to first address the modernization investments that we've made in the past decade. So, General Murray, during the height of the war in Iraq from 2003 to 2011, the Army received about $500 billion in total modernization funding, including the peak year in 2008, where it received $91 billion in that year alone. How did the Army use that funding? How much of that equipment do we still have? Did it all simply get consumed in the war, and do you see a present and future use for it?
Thank you, ma'am. So most of that, and both General Anderson and I were there during the years you mentioned, so most of that was consumed, in my estimate, by the counter-IED fight. So it was protection for our soldiers, it was MRAPs, it was up-armoring Humvees, it was additional munitions procurement, it was better body armor, helmets. I mean, that is where most of that money went, plus the recapitalization of the equipment that was rotating in and out of theater. My guess would be that where the lion's share of that money went. Now, are we still using some of that equipment? We absolutely are. So the Humvees are still in the inventory. The MRAPs we've got in an APS set in Italy, a lesser number, but we are retaining MRAPs for future contingency use. And we're also using MRAPs within the current force. So within Force Comm, our EOD soldiers, route clearance soldiers are still operating MRAPs just like they did in Iraq in 2008, the year you mentioned.
Well, the reason I wanted to bring this issue up is to better understand the areas in which the Army didn't modernize during the Iraq War, and what areas were thought to be of lesser priority and became delayed. I think you've referenced some of them, but just again to sort of reiterate where you see the capability gaps as a result of those investments.
Yes, ma'am. So, and I said this in the opening statement, so we focused on the equipment we needed for Iraq and Afghanistan, and I look back on it, and I don't think I would have done anything differently if I was in the position to make those decisions. So the areas we took risk were areas that were not important to us in that type of fight. So it was air defense systems. It was specifically maneuverable air defense systems that could keep up with armored brigade combat teams. And there's some assumptions about both of these. The other one was probably long-range indirect fires. So most of the indirect fires that I used in Iraq and Afghanistan were cannon delivered, and the range we had with cannon delivered was fine. And then you always had the collateral damage concerns. So the other thing that was an assumption is, when the defense strategy was written back in 2012. And I'm sure you've heard the chief talk about this, there were some fundamental assumptions made. One is, we weren't facing a resurgent Russia at that point in time. And we made the assumption, and it has proved to be a bad assumption a long time ago, that we didn't really need to worry about air defense, and we didn't really need to worry about long-range precision fires because we had the best systems in the world. It was called the United States Air Force. And with capabilities we're seeing right now that the Russians have developed and the Chinese are developing, we have to reinvest some effort, and we really haven't upgraded those systems in a long time. It wasn't just the war in Iraq and Afghanistan that caused us to assume some risk in those areas.
Well, I appreciate your forthcomingness, but I do know that there were areas where the Army did recapitalize quite substantially, and you mentioned, I think, some of them in the areas of aircraft, wheeled vehicles, which you talked about, and communications gear. So I think it's really just to sort of reiterate the point that the Army is not saddled with old and outdated equipment across the board. There are some areas in decent shape, wouldn't you say?
Yes, ma'am, and you pointed out a couple other things that's absolutely still in use. So the communication systems we're still using. We continue to upgrade the tank and Bradley, and it's really the equipment we used in theater and aircraft specifically. We made some significant upgrades with the aircraft, and we're in pretty good shape in some areas. The problem we're seeing now is you can only do so much to old platforms, and you reach a point of, for instance, the M1 tank. I mean, with the most recent upgrade, it's approaching 80 tons, and we have just about upgraded that platform as much as we can possibly add to or upgrade it, and we're reaching the point of limited returns on the upgrades. And we will reach that, I think, at some point, we got to make some upgrades, some more upgrades to the aviation, because we added a lot of protection to our aviation platforms, which has reduced the reach and the range and the amount of equipment or personnel an aircraft can carry. So things like the ITEP engine are designed to regain what we've lost. But I don't think we have any piece of equipment that you can say is going to be good for the next 10, 15, 20 years. We're going to have to continue to upgrade, or we're going to have to go to a new development.
Well, I'd like to do one more question, sort of go in that direction, and that is the Army's 2017 R&D funding request of about $7.6 billion continued what I think is a very disturbing trend of a decline in what I think is a very important part of the Army's budget, in fact, I think across the services. As compared to the most recent peak of $14.3 billion in 2008, it is down almost 50%. Furthermore, last year's projection for future years wasn't much better, with R&D funding holding steady around $7 billion in a year. In your testimony, you mentioned these important capability gaps in several areas, such as electronic warfare, long-range fires, and air defense systems. And in addition, the Army continues to invest in important research in areas such as body armor materials and other force protection technology. My concern is this: how the Army can possibly address those gaps in the future if R&D spending doesn't go up. You're really, I think, really making it very much more difficult given the rapid change in technology. What areas will the Army have to fund itself, and how much more will be needed?
Yes, ma'am. The how much more is a difficult question, and you know, the good news, the R&D is a piece of it. The S&T piece is the other part of that. We have protected S&T investments, and that's a little bit further out than the R&D piece, the $61, $62, $63, which you're familiar with. You know, so I said we about a 50% over the last 8 years of what it was 8 years ago. So in today's dollars, 8 years ago is about 44. Today, in 17 budget, it's about $22 billion in terms of what we would consider research, or what we would consider what I control in the equipping. R&D is a piece of that. So historically, RDT&E is about a third of that dollar figure, and procurement is about 2/3 of that dollar figure. So it's balancing that checkbook and getting the right balance between, you know, how much do you do to continue to field equipment? And we're fielding a significant amount of equipment. It's not like we have all the equipment we need right now and we're just upgrading stuff. We're also fielding new equipment, and we have equipment in the pipeline, JLTV, AMPV, IFPIC, et cetera, that's under development. And how much can you, and it's this balance I talked about, is, you know, how much risk do you take in the near term in order to focus more resources on what comes a little bit further out? And it's really, where do you want to accept that risk?
How much are you taking advantage of technological innovation in the private sector? I know Massachusetts is fortunate to have a Defense Innovation Unit, experimental, DIUX. There are others across, there's one in California, I think in Texas, or to be in Texas. How are you taking advantage of that innovation so you're not reinventing the wheel?
DIUX, one specific program that I'm working pretty much personally is it's called SMET. It's the Squad Mission and Equipment Transporter. So the concept is that you take, you know, equipment that's available in the commercial market. You put it on what we would call a mule. It's just a basic vehicle that transports equipment. It takes 1,000 pounds. It can transport. It's almost like a leader follower technology. Follows soldiers that are dismounted. So you take all the ammunition off their back. You take the water off their back. You take the rucksacks off their back. And we're in very constant communications with DIUX on that. We're also working with the Strategic Capabilities Office on some other, not necessarily commercially available, but stuff that's already in DoD's inventory that we can reuse in different ways to try to shave some costs.
Thank you. I yield back.